Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 339. This is a special episode, which I'm calling 30 Under 20, or 30 Great Jazz Records that you can get for under $20. Now, in a previous special episode, the one where I talked about collecting vintage jazz, I mentioned that price and quality don't always go hand in hand. For example, Jimmy Smith, who's a great musician, has a zillion records for Blue Note, which are pretty good, but they're not necessarily any better than a lot of other soul jazz, organ heavy music that was being put out in the 50s and 1960s, but they go for significantly more money. Why? Because they're Blue Note releases. Nothing against Jimmy Smith. I have some of his records and they're great, but there's another side to the story. Great records that sound great and won't cost you very much. So here we go, 30 jazz records of which good copies can be found for $20 or less. Before we start, a couple of definitional pieces. So first of all, what is a great jazz record? Now, there's no need to take my word for what a great jazz record is. All the records I'm talking about have been reviewed by all kinds of people. Those reviews are readily available. I own each one of them, of course, and each one in this stack has survived multiple sweeps that I've done through my collection at various points to kind of keep it in check. So they haven't been culled, they haven't been sold. I've kept them around because I love them. And of course, there are way more than 30 great jazz records out there that can be gotten for bargain prices. Obviously, I'm talking about the ones that I have. The point of this video is to encourage you to explore and experiment rather than just sort of assuming what the best records are. Go out there and listen, and don't necessarily chase these elusive and expensive holy grail records. Not that there's anything wrong with doing that. In compiling this list and doing the research, I'm trying to present a fairly broad cross section. Of the 30 records I'm going to talk about, I think 13 count as hard bop. There's a couple of modal ones. There's 4 that are primarily cool jazz. There were 3 that are primarily bossa nova. 3 are kind of funky soul jazz. I've got 2 vocal, 1 big band, 1 swing, and 1 which is pretty squarely avant-garde. As for what counts as a good copy of that, well, first of all, what I mean is it's on a legitimate label. It's not on some dodgy East European label run by guys in tracksuits and gold chains who are cutting everything off CDs. In most cases, what I'm talking about is being able to find a version of the record on the original label with the original artwork, sometimes in a later iteration of that label when it's been bought out, but still legitimately issued under that label's name. I'm talking about pre-digital analog pressings, in many cases, pressings that are available within the first 2 or 3 years of release, sometimes more recent analog remasters, worst case scenario, a decent mid-80s OJC reissue or a 70s reissue. So in doing the research, I delved into Discogs and I made sure that you could find those kinds of releases for the kinds of prices I'm talking about. And there needed to be multiple copies at that particular price point, roughly, to be able to say you could get it. And when I say multiple copies, I should say multiple copies, having already limited my search to VG+. So these should be records in good condition, official releases on the proper labels, and often within a year or two of the original release. One thing I should point out is that these prices obviously do not include shipping, which, as we all know, has gone bananas in recent years. You can try and alleviate that, I guess, by buying bulk. Anyway, all those disclaimers and qualifications aside, let's get on to the records. And the very first one, which my research suggests you should be able to get for about 20 bucks, is John Coltrane's record with his quartet, Crescent. This is an absolutely terrific record. It is the immediate predecessor to A Love Supreme. It has a lot of the same feel to the music that A Love Supreme has. And in fact, a lot of people who, at a certain point of being real Coltrane heads, have kind of been all Love Supremed out, will often move on to this record, something which is just a little bit less overexposed. Next, also available for about $20. Actually, this is a bit of a multiple one because Art Pepper, in the later stages of his career, before he died, did a whole bunch of great records in the 1970s. In particular, a bunch of records live at the Village Vanguard. He did 4, in fact. There's a Thursday night, which I have here, strangely on a Yugoslav pressing, but it actually sounds quite good on Yugotone. There's a Friday night, there's a Saturday night, and then I think there's one other one. I forget the title. Anyway, there's 4 of them. They all come out around 1979 or thereabouts. They are absolutely excellent. They're the most, I guess, fantastic manifestations of his late career renaissance. And you absolutely cannot go wrong. You should be able to get any of these for about 20 bucks. Now, getting cheaper, 18 bucks. Miles Davis and the Modern Jazz Giants. Now, there's a very famous record that Miles Davis put out called Bag's Groove, and that is a bit of a Frankenstein record because it cobbles together recording sessions with different groups that Miles was engaged with in and around 1954. One of those sessions was Christmas Eve 1954, and it was made with the people on this record. Miles, obviously, on trumpet, with Milt Jackson on vibes, Monk on piano, Percy Heath on bass, and the great Kenny Clarke on drums. This record, only released in the early 70s, is the first time all of that session exclusively was compiled on one record. So what you have is the tracks that are familiar to people who've listened to Bag's Groove, plus also some alternate takes, which are fascinating in and of themselves just because of the different approaches. Anyway, highly, highly recommended. My copy's cover is a bit battered, but you should be able to get this, as I say, for around $18 American. Now, next, the avant-garde entry. This is not the original cover, but it is the original label, Prestige. This is Eric Dolphy's record from 1961, Out There. And in 1961, Eric Dolphy, along with Ornette Coleman, was basically the beating heart of avant-garde music in New York. He's somebody whom Coltrane was highly influenced by, and in picking this record up, you're probably best off looking for an OJC reissue from the early 1980s. But again, you should be able to get this for under $20. Next, we have an Impulse release with a very undistinguished looking, kind of show-tuney looking cover, which is no surprise because it in fact is a soundtrack record made by Sonny Rollins for Impulse to the Michael Caine vehicle Alfie. And I suppose this is the time to do my Michael Caine impression, or not. Anyway, this is a really tremendous recording. It's one of Rollins' best records of the 1960s. It's flown under the radar, I think, because people think, it's a soundtrack record, whatever. Put that out of your head. It's great. It's one of those original Impulses. It's actually relatively easy to find, although to get it for the price I'm suggesting, which is what? About $15. You probably have to get a reissue. Anyway, one of Rollins' best. Excellent record. You will not regret picking that up, despite the cover. Now, on to the genius of the piano and of modern music, Thelonious Monk. And this is his record from 1965 called Monk, with a period after it. This is Monk with a trio. It's well recorded and it's the quirky master at close to his best. You should be able to get this for about $15. Next, now I mentioned that usually you can get the original artwork. That's not always the case. There was a record company called Candid, which Nat Hentoff, the jazz critic, was the A&R guy for, and he was also the producer for. Around 1960-61, they put out a bunch of great records, including some records by Booker Ervin. This is one of them, but Candid folds in 1964, and it's bought by another record label called Barnaby. And in the early 70s, Barnaby reissues a bunch of these great titles on Candid with somewhat, I guess all we could say is 70s looking covers. And this is Booker Ervin's tremendous record, That's It. With the cutout, you can see it didn't sell very much at the time. That's what those punch holes and cutouts mean. This is some pretty stellar hard bop, and it's available for about $15. Prices are going down, do you notice? Now, next, this is an absolute classic. It's shocking how cheaply one can pick up this record, because really it's one of the kind of high water marks of hard bop, certainly in the 1960s anyway. And this is the debut record from Benny Golson and Art Farmer and their collective venture called the Jazztet, which also features not only Curtis Fuller, but an unheralded and not yet famous McCoy Tyner on piano. And there's Addison Farmer, Art's twin, on bass, and Lex Humphreys hiding back there on the drums. This photograph, incidentally, is taken at Nola's Penthouse studio in New York. You'll often see it on other album covers as well, with that sort of distinctive, weird-looking gold curtain. Anyway, this is, well, I mean, the Jazztet in general was a tremendous project. Golson and Farmer are excellent musicians, and this probably is the peak of their output with that particular group. A hard bop classic, which again is available for something like $15. That's also true of this record, made by Sergio Mendes. This is titled In the Brazilian Bag, but it's actually a reissue of a record that was first issued under the name of Mendes's group Brasil 65, which was his touring group with a couple other folks that aren't featured on the cover here, Wanda de Sa, the singer, and the great guitarist Rosina de Valença. Anyway, so it was a 5-piece band. They toured the US in the summer of 65 during that whole flourishing of the bossa nova sound. A really, really, really good record, and one you should pick up whether you find the original cover or this one, which is actually much more frequent. $15, like I say. And another $15 special is this one. What is it? Is this the first one? Might be. No, it's the second ever release on Impulse. Ray Charles, Genius plus Soul equals Jazz, arranged by Quincy Jones, amongst others. And this is the record, or one of the records, in which Creed Taylor selected a big name to help him launch his fledgling brand new jazz label, Impulse. This is a record with all of the hallmarks of the great Impulse sort of record packaging and production. You can find gatefold copies of this still relatively cheaply. And it's basically a big band record, although obviously inimitably Ray Charles, but it's not the Ray Charles of the Atlantic records. Still a great record, a very fun record. So that is a $15 special again. Now, here we go. Sarah Vaughan in Hi-Fi. Now, this is a record you can pick up for about $12. It's an expanded reissue. She had put out a 10-inch record in 1950, also called Sarah Vaughan in Hi-Fi, so make sure not to get them confused. This is expanded to a 12-inch LP, obviously with a few additional tracks. It's interesting not only because the music is wonderful, her singing is incredible, but there are some players on here who would go on to greater things. Not that being on this record isn't great, but you know what I mean. Miles Davis, young Miles Davis, is on trumpet. Tony Scott is on clarinet, and Mundell Lowe, the great guitarist, is on guitar. A really, really good one on Columbia and worth picking up when you see it. Next, a change of pace. We're moving into the 1970s with an ECM release by Keith Jarrett. This is the first release. It's called the Survivors Suite. This is the first release by his famous American quartet with Dewey Redman, the great bassist Charlie Hayden, and the great drummer who had drummed, of course, for Bill Evans all those years before, Paul Motion. Again, called the Survivors Suite. Tremendous ECM style jazz. I mean, basically Keith Jarrett and ECM are almost synonymous with each other. That kind of spare kind of Euro jazz sound, but very beautiful nonetheless. And anything with Charlie Hayden's bass playing, and frankly Dewey Redman's saxophone as well, is worth picking up. And this can be gotten for about $12, believe it or not. See, there's a little saw cut. Another record that just didn't sell at the time for whatever reason, but it is tremendous. And the last of the records that cost over $10 in this list is this one, Jazz Samba. I've talked about this record numerous times in this channel. This is ground zero for the bossa nova explosion in 1962 with Stan Getz and Charlie Byrd. Getz goes on to basically rule the world. Bossa nova, Charlie Byrd doesn't, but it's a tremendous record in a wonderful package, and you should be able to get it for about $12. Now, all the rest of the records I'm going to show you are available for $10 or less. I'm going to start with a record that I don't actually have here to show you because it's en route, and that is Clifford Brown and Max Roach's record at Basin Street, which sounds like it's recorded at a club because it's named after a club, but it's not. It's actually a studio effort. It is probably the greatest record that Clifford Brown ever made. It may arguably be the greatest record that Max Roach ever made. It may be the greatest record that Sonny Rollins ever made. Anyway, it is a hard bop classic. It's one of the last records that Clifford Brown and Richie Powell made before they died in that car crash a few months later. It is available stunningly for about $10, give or take, in a reasonable version. And it's a record, frankly, that any hard bop collection should not be without. Kind of an interesting story about that record as well, is that it was part of a swap deal because Rollins was actually a prestige artist and the Brown Roach Quintet were recording for MRC, which was a subsidiary of Mercury. And the deal was that they would record a record for MRC and then they would record a record for Prestige, and they would go back and forth like that as long as Rollins was in the group. This was a deal made between the two labels. There was this record made, then there was a record, Sonny Rollins Plus 4, made for Prestige. But then the whole relationship winds up, of course, when Brown and Powell are killed just a few months later. Now, back to the records I actually have here. And the next one here, again, available for about $10, is J.J. Johnson's hard bop, solidly hard bop classic, J is for Jazz. The players on here, if I can find them, are really quite remarkable. Tommy Flanagan, Elvin Jones, Percy Heath, Hank Jones. So these guys are all basically uh, hard bop royalty. Really wonderful piece of trombone jazz. I personally am coming to feel that trombone is a greatly underrated jazz instrument, and I'm seeking it out more and more. And this is a great example of one of the greatest exponents of the trombone, J.J. Johnson. Okay, speaking of great exponents of hard bop, we're back to Clifford Brown. Now, Clifford Brown made a record with a whole bunch of sidemen in LA who played for Pacific and Contemporary Records in I'm going to forget the date, anyway, around 1955. Couldn't have been after 1956. In any event, it was released on Pacific, and then this is the European release on Fontana. On Pacific, it's called Jazz Immortal. You'll see it all over the place. Warm is the title of the Fontana release in 1960. It is very similar in feel to another similar kind of effort, Sonny Rollins' work with the contemporary leaders, in that you have this East Coast bop star with all of these West Coast session players. The combination works extremely well. It's beautifully, beautifully recorded. Snap it up if you can, and you should be able to find it in decent condition for about $10. Now, onwards, and this is an interesting record. This is on the one side Bud Shank and Shorty Rogers with three other folks in a quintet, and on the second side it's Bud Shank and Bill Perkins with three other guys in a quintet. And the players here again are West Coast jazz royalty, people like Hampton Hawes, the tenor player Bill Perkins, the wonderful, wonderful bass player Red Mitchell. Bud Shank, of course, who leads both sessions, is that tremendous alto player who started off very cool in his career, but then got very much more aggressively hard bopish in the later stages of his career. Other people here, Shorty Rogers, of course, a great trumpet and flugelhorn player, and Harry Babison and Roy Hart, who, of course, were the co-owners of Nocturne Records, but also musicians in their own right. This is a cool jazz must-have, or certainly a key part of any cool jazz collection from the West Coast, and I think it can be found for not too much cash. Now, next, Paul Desmond, of course, known to the world as the foil to Dave Brubeck's piano with his wonderful alto saxophone. In fact, I think I've said it before in this channel, he's the reason to listen to Dave Brubeck records. He did a few kind of dodgy things for CTI in the early 1970s, but on this one, which is 1975, Pure Desmond, he works only with a quartet. On here we have Ron Carter on bass, Connie Kay on drums, and a relatively unknown guitar player, a guy called Ed Bickert. This conjures up very much the sound and the feel of Desmond's wonderful records from the early 60s that he did with Jim Hall. So it's called Pure Desmond. Again, that classic sort of Creed Taylor, very, very slick, glossy packaging, but the music inside, more importantly, is excellent, and that can be gotten for about $10. But now we're going lower than 10. Here is another one of these East Coast, West Coast collaborations, and this is the record that Quincy Jones did with a whole bunch of West Coast session guys out in LA, and it's called, unsurprisingly, Go West Man. And if you look at the names of the people who also appear on this record, which you probably can't read, maybe you can, I'll just hold it up there for a second. But Shelly Manne, Buddy Collette, Bill Perkins, Red Mitchell, Leroy Vinegar, Benny Carter, Charlie Mariano, Art Pepper is on here, Pepper Adams, the Candoli brothers. Essentially, it's pretty much a who's who of the, not just the session players on the West Coast for Pacific and Contemporary, but a lot of the people who are regularly leading sessions as well. This is a really nice mix of cool jazz and hard bop with just a splash of big band sound in there as well, and one of the early highlights of Quincy Jones's career. About $9 you can get that for. Now, moving ahead to the 70s, here is a record by Jimmy McGriff, the Hammond specialist, called Let's Stay Together. This is about as classic an early 70s soul jazz record as you could ever want to find. There are covers of contemporary tracks like Let's Stay Together by Al Green, theme from Shaft, Marvin Gaye's What's Going On, Georgia on My Mind, and so on. But it is just righteous, and I can't really recommend this highly enough, particularly as you can get it for about $8. Next, another 70s funky offering, and that is this record by Ramsey Lewis with its absolutely epic cover, Sun Goddess. This is a collaboration between Ramsey Lewis, who was kind of a, not quite cocktail jazz, but he had piano trios all the way through the 1960s, which were just kind of fun, uh, pleasing, not too challenging, but very enjoyable jazz records that he made all the way through the 1960s. He would cover a well-known pop tune and do a jazz version of it, and that would be the title of the album. And he kind of repeated that formula all the way through the 60s. This is different. Here he is in his funkier days, and it's a collaboration with one of his alumni from his sextets, Morris White, who of course went on to found Earth, Wind and Fire. Morris is here playing with him, as is Verdine White. His brother, Philip Bailey from Earth, Wind and Fire, is also on here. And here's Ramsey with some of the guys absolutely styling the 70s look. Great record, about $8. Also available for about $8 is this outing by Grover Washington Jr. I've talked about this record on the channel before. It's absolutely superb. Arguably the high watermark for Kudu, which was Creed Taylor's jazz funk sub imprint from CTI. Title track, blow your mind, but the rest of the album is not bad either, and a great cover. Once again, available for $8. Now, some more bossa nova. Here's a record which you can get for about $8, which is by Stan Getz and Astrid Gilberto. Now, recall that they had made, along with Astrid's husband Joao Gilberto and Antonio Carlos Jobim, they had made a record called Getz Gilberto, which basically broke all kinds of sales records and won the Grammy, and all the rest of it was basically the high watermark of all of the whole bossa nova splash that happened in 62, 63, 64. This is a tour that Getz goes on with Astrid after that record comes out, and after she has split from her husband Joao. Now, she splits from Joao before this tour happens. Later on in the tour, there may have been some intimacy between Stan and Astrid. At some point, Astrid realizes that Stan is basically a basket full of issues, and she heads for the exit door. But no matter, this record really captures, and it's in a small club too, captures a lot of that intimacy and magic that her voice and his saxophone had together. Strongly recommended. Another $8 special. For $7, an impulse release. You might be able to find an original copy, but you certainly can find a repress for that kind of money. Count Basie. Now, folks who watch this channel know that I'm not the hugest big band fan in the world. As much as I respect people like Basie and Ellington, I just don't like the sound of big massed horn sections. It's kind of overwhelming to me. So when I want to hear the great compositions that people like this wrote, I love to hear them in small groups. And this is an example of that. Basie in a very small group, beautifully recorded by Rudy Van Gelder, and Frank Foster's tenor sax and Thad Jones's trumpet are fantastic on this record. About $7, thereabouts. Now, here's another classic. This is one where you probably can't find the original pressing and the original artwork unless you're willing to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars. This is Serge Chaloff's wonderful record, Blue Surge, and this is a 1972 reissue. It came out originally on Capitol with, frankly, much better artwork. This is the 1972 reissue cover, but importantly, the sound of this record is absolutely fantastic. And the record has a lineup which is basically peerless. You've got Sonny Clark on piano, you've got Philly Joe Jones on drums, and Leroy Vinegar on bass. The original will cost you, but the 72 issue is very nice. Strongly recommended for about $7. Next, also for $7, Oscar Peterson's Night Train. If you don't have any Oscar Peterson records, this is a pretty good place to start. Oscar Peterson, of course, is known for his incredible technical ability on the piano. I'm not always the biggest fan of Oscar because I sometimes find his playing a little bit sterile, but this record is an exception. I think it's a real tour de force. His group plays a whole bunch of different standards, and he has a real bluesy feel to a lot of his playing here. Bluesier and more, I don't know, what's the word, more elastic than I guess I'm used to on his records. Anyway, don't at me, Oscar fans, but this Oscar record, I think everybody can agree, is excellent. Moving back to the West Coast and back to the 1950s, here is a record released by Jerry Mulligan after he got out of jail. He'd been jailed in 1953, the latter half of it, for a heroin bust. He gets out of jail, forms a new group. He's still kind of a big name on the West Coast scene. And this is a record which compiles a series of concerts which he did. The sidemen on here are really quite something. Chico Hamilton is on drums. Red Mitchell again is on bass. And there's also appearances by Zoot Sims and Bob Brookmeyer. So no problem with the musicians. The sound is very good, and it's a very nice early document of that particular sound, very much associated with Mulligan, of those contrapuntal horns. Anyway, well worth picking up. $7. Now, I have managed to find 3 great jazz records which you can find in good condition for $5 and under. And the first of these is the last of the Bossa Nova entries, although it's sort of a Bossa Nova record and sort of a vocal jazz record. It's a record that Frank Sinatra did with Antonio Carlos Jobim in 1967. Some people, you can find this on the internet, would argue this is Sinatra's finest vocal outing. I'm not so sure about this, but it's pretty darn good, because what he does is take some songs, Jobim songs, these Bossa Nova standards, which were basically wall-to-wall ubiquitous in the 1960s, and he takes them and he puts his own inimitable Sinatra-esque stamp on them and just turns them all into his own. Jobim, of course, is also playing on this record. It's just magical. It is a combination that maybe ought not to have worked, but works extremely well, and you can get it for about $5. I'm going to close this with 2 trio records which came out on Contemporary Records, both involving the piano player Andre Previn and the drummer Shelly Manne. The first of those is under Previn's name. They had a bit of a deal, Previn and Manne, where they put out a whole bunch of records which used show tunes as the core material, I guess. And they would vary who was the leader. Previn was the leader for some of the records, and Manne was the leader for others. I think they're all pretty good, and some of these records are excellent. This is one of the excellent ones. I think it's the best one that has Previn as a leader. It's the music of West Side Story. The bassist on here is, again, Red Mitchell, who, if you can't tell by now, I think is the bee's knees. You should be able to get this for about $5. And when you get it for about $5, what you're getting also is that incredible contemporary sound, the engineering of Roy Dunan. The earlier the pressing, the better, but even the later ones in the 70s and early 80s are well worth grabbing. So strongly recommend it, and a bargain. And for about $3, you can pick up the record which was Contemporary's best-selling record, maybe ever, I think, or certainly of the 1950s. And that is another trio record. This time it's Shelly Manne, not Andre Previn, as the leader, and it's based on the music from the musical My Fair Lady. Another absolutely brilliant record. And I should say that both of these records are not cool jazz, even though they're made on the West Coast. They're very much in the hard bop lane. I mean, it's not what you call a challenging music, and it's piano trio music, but it's very well played, very pleasing to listen to, and really for $3, you cannot go wrong. And I can tell you cannot go wrong with this particular lineup, with in this case Leroy Vinnegar on bass, the master of the walking bass. So there we go, 30 records that aren't going to break the bank. There may be lots of other suggestions, and if you have suggestions, please do put them in the comments. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.